You're listening to Love and Libido with me, your host, Dr. Emily Jamea. The goal of this podcast is to educate and inspire. My hope is that you will learn tools to create connection and cultivate passion, both within yourself and in your relationships. Here's what's coming up on today's episode.
Sometimes you get like somebody who's kind of perfectionistic, a little bit OCD, being drawn to somebody with ADHD. The person who's kind of perfectionistic who likes the creativity and the liveliness of the person with ADHD. The person with ADD, I just keep saying ADHD, but it could be ADD, really likes to be grounded by the person who's more perfectionistic and on top of things. But eventually the charm wears off.
Oh yeah, I can definitely see how there would be an initial draw for each person in that kind of relationship and how over time it could be a major source of conflict, right? Because I think you highlighted something, and that is that a lot of ADHD people are very creative and can seem very exciting because they have a lot of things that they're thinking about at any given time. And I think that can be a huge draw for people. But then when you're living under the same roof potentially and trying to share household chores, suddenly you realize there's just, like you said, unfinished projects or piles of things everywhere that go unfinished, and that can end up being really frustrating, right? And so I think some of these quirks can deepen into resentments, and I've certainly worked with couples where that feeds into their desire to have sex, because it gets to the point where they feel like the person who doesn't have ADHD is the one who ends up having to finish everything. And a lot of the burden ends up being one that they shoulder. And they're the ones that have to, especially when they have kids potentially, and then they're the ones that have to, keep the kids organized and the household organized, and they start resenting their partner who is very disorganized. And over time, that can be kind of a libido killer. What has your experience been with that?
Oh, definitely. It becomes a big turn off. And yet the person, now again, the person with ADHD, person who is kind of forgetful, spaced out, they sometimes tend to have a low drive as well, right? Because they're having a really hard time just staying on top of things. Sometimes the person who is more hyperactive, they have a high drive. So then and then with all these other things going on, you can really have kind of a mismatch on multiple levels for couples like this. And they really struggle. It's really rough for them.
Yeah. So people, like what you're saying, people who have more the inattentive type, where there's just difficulty focusing, may end up having a lower desire for sex because they have a hard time getting into it. They find that their mind starts to wander. And I think those kinds of people can get very easily distracted by different sensory systems. So if they're touched in a specific way, just something that's very subtle to one person may completely throw them off. And that can be very frustrating, versus people who have more the hyperactive type. Sometimes they can have even higher libido because they're thinking creatively all the time. And sometimes these people can be the ones that keep the sex exciting because they're thinking of different things that they might try with their partner. And so there can be, I think, depending on the type, some benefit if there's not too big of a mismatch with the partner who doesn't have ADD.
Yes. And I think sometimes the person who's more hyperactive will complain of boredom. Right? They get bored in the bedroom, and then they kind of lose their interest. Sometimes they get into a little trouble because they're impulsive. So they're seeking some gratification elsewhere. I don't want to say, that's all people with ADHD who are inattentive are at risk for that, but that does happen. I think there is a little bit more of a risk because of the impulsivity as well. So boredom and impulsivity can lead to problems, inattentiveness, and lack of initiative in the more the inattentive type. that can lead to a different set of problems.
Yeah. So what is your best advice to couples who may be struggling with ADHD being a factor in their relationship, and just in terms of the relationship dynamic itself?
Yeah. So one thing is, first of all, the person who does not have, both of them need to educate themselves.
Yeah, that's
They
huge.
need to understand that this is kind of like a glitch in the neurology in the brain, in the systems of the brain, the systems that keep us paying attention, and being able to switch attention on and off appropriately. And there should not be any finger pointing. I mean, this would be like say somebody has diabetes, and now, they have to really like change their diet in some way. Well, the partner who doesn't have diabetes can't get like indignant and say, "What do you mean we have to change our diet?
Right.
That's terrible." So they both need to educate themselves and understand what it is and what it isn't as well. It is something that can be managed, right? It's not like a something, again, it's kind of like diabetes. You can take medication, or you can manage it with diet and exercise. There are different things that you can do. So
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
And
Um,
if I may, I like that you bring up how important it is that the partner without ADHD responds compassionately and is part of the treatment, because a lot of times people who have ADHD are already, we talked about, anxious. They can become very self-conscious. And so if they're constantly feeling badgered by their partner because they're quote unquote not trying hard enough, I think that's what a lot of people think. If you would just try harder, this wouldn't be a problem. And they may be really doing the best that they can. And for that to not be recognized by the other person can be a major blow to self-esteem and ego, which then only exacerbates the problem or adds more problems.
Absolutely. All of that conflict is not good for your sex life.
No.
That blaming and low self-esteem, and yeah, definitely not romantic, not sexy.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say is a reasonable expectation? Let's say when it comes to something specific, like finishing household tasks, when you're living with someone with ADHD, how can people negotiate what gets done? What is a reasonable expectation to have?
Well, I one thing that I think has worked is figuring out the strengths of the person with ADHD and using them. So what are the tasks that they would find? It's not that the person without ADHD should take on all of the certain kinds of tasks, but what are the ones that they're more likely to finish? And I also recommend that they, excuse me, that they schedule things on their phone. They write things down, and maybe as a couple, they sit down once a week and they go through what are the things that need to get done and assign them in some way that is equitable. And what are the things that the person with ADHD or ADD is likely to complete? Well, like aim for success.
Right, right. Yeah, and maybe lower the bar a little bit. I think sometimes we have unrealistic expectations. And like you were saying, I love the diabetes analogy because it's just not something that a lot of people can help. Like any medical or mental diagnosis, sometimes these things just happen. But I think there's obviously still so much stigma when it comes to mental health and the diagnosis of mental health problems. And so I do think it's really important that people use the medical model when formulating their expectations and negotiating contributions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think too, the other thing though is the person with ADHD, and I heard you say, maybe they're trying the best that they can. Well, yes, that's true. They may be trying the best that they can, but there may be other things that they need to try, other tools that they need to incorporate into their day, into their week to keep them organized. I think that if you're in a relationship, like it or not, you have a responsibility to like bring your best self into the relationship.
If you liked this video, drop me a like and subscribe below. Share with a friend who might find it interesting. You can also listen to this in podcast form anywhere podcasts are streamed by searching for Love and Libido with Dr. Emily Jamea. Finally, follow me across all social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamea for daily emotional and physical intimacy tips.